Hi, I'm Dr. Scott Stripling, Provost at the Bible Seminary, and I have the distinct honor today of co-hosting today's podcast along with my colleague, Dr. Doug Petrovich, our Professor of Exegesis and Biblical History at the Bible Seminary. Tell us about our guest.
We have a wonderful guest today here for you. This is the man that I affectionately refer to as the leading biblical chronologist in the world today. His name is Rodger Young. He's from St. Louis. He's retired. He was in the computer field. He did programming and developing and systems analysis. And he has since retirement, he has had a rich ministry in biblical chronology. So we want to welcome him to the show, and we want to begin with a question for him, which is, Rodger, how did God guide you into the study of the field of chronology?
To answer, there are actually some things that happened before I became a Christian, and of course to be interested in you is because I am a Christian. But there are some things that took place before. At the age of 23, I asked Christ to be my Savior, and those things were, one was that even in high school, I was interested in ancient things and got taken up. Another friend of mine were kind of what we might call avant-garde thinkers. We were very taken up with a man named Emanuel Velikovsky, who dealt with biblical things, biblical themes like the flood, and he dealt with the Exodus. But he redated the ancient history of Egypt by a significant amount. And we young people who were very liberal in our thinking and so on, we very much were taken with that. The other thing that happened was that when I went to college, I wanted to be a physics major, but I went to a college where all people who attending, we had to study the ancient history of our civilization. So about half of our freshman year was spent on the humanities. And again, there was an interest in history there that was generated, even though I still kept my major in the sciences. So those two things were, even before I was a Christian, were part of why I was interested in ancient history.
And where did you grow up? What state, what city?
Well, I was born in Michigan and grew up, might say, on the shores of Lake Huron until the age of 10. And then we moved to California, and I went to high school there and went to college, Reed College in Portland, Oregon. After Reed, my undergraduate days there, I went to Oxford in England. My degrees are in physics and at Oxford in physical mathematics.
And in your writings about chronology, what are a couple of the major themes that you've addressed?
A major theme, you might say, address is the harmony of the Bible in its presentation of chronology. Now, if you read the Bible, there are these many verses you look at that King X of Judah began to reign in year Y of the king of Israel, and he reigned so and so many years, and you just sort of gloss over those. You might be interested in the name of the mother of King X, but you actually find that there are, throughout the Old Testament particularly, there are an abundance of these references, and sometimes we miss the forest for the trees. The trees are these references that just throughout the Hebrew Bible, that is what's called the Old Testament, we find these things, but the forest is that there's a pattern of those all the way through from Adam, the creation of Adam, down to perhaps the last strictly datable event, which was when Jehoiakim was released from captivity in the year that Marduk became king, which is given an exact date. So for the whole period, from Adam down to the end of the kingdom period, we find the forest, which is all this data that must be given there. You think it's given for a purpose. You see, there must be some purpose behind this.
So there's an interesting connection that you two guys have. When you were studying all this through and building your chronology, Dr. Petrovich actually played a role in that. Can you briefly tell us that story?
Well, I mentioned Velikovsky. And Velikovsky was a very interesting writer, a Russian by birth, had 2 PhDs, and he began to write with books with very engaging titles such as Ages in Chaos, Worlds in Collision, and Earth in Upheaval. Very interesting books. He wrote English better than his critics, and he was native Russian. And so those of us like David Rohl and Peter James and so on, who are not strictly nowadays following Velikovsky, and I'm certainly not, we might be called the sons of Velikovsky. One of the problems I had was that the biblical date that is very firm for the Exodus, 1446 BC, seemed to be in the reign of Thutmose III. he was the greatest of all the conquerors of Egypt. Just one conquest after another into Canaan and just unstoppable, like a Napoleon. And well, Napoleon got stopped, of course. And he died as a conquering. Well, how did the Exodus fit in that? And one day I got a call from someone in California named Doug Petrovich, and he was asking some help in writing an article, his first article he ever got published. And I presented this to him, and he pointed out that the correct chronology, according to what he had figured out, was Amenhotep II, which is the son of Thutmose III, who had an interesting career. And then I no longer had this objection to, and why I had to hold on to Velikovsky's chronology, and I do not hold on to Velikovsky's or David Roll's chronology now, but I did for a long time. And Dr. Petrovich was the one who showed me, no, things fit much better in the reign of Amenhotep II.
Doug, how did that impress you at the time when you saw you were reaching out to him for help, but then he was receptive to what you were sharing too?
Yeah, I mean, I never expected that anything I would have to say in the article would be something that would change the view at all of, a chronologist of his credibility. So I was just looking for help in making sure I was doing everything right, and if there was something wrong in my article, that he would help me see that. And he did, that came through in spades. He helped me to eliminate a number of small errors within the article that gave it much more credibility and obviously much more difficult to disprove. And from then until now, he has critiqued every one of my articles.
Well, and just fairness to the listener and the viewer today, he's helped me in articles, and so we're both in your debt, Rodger, and so we really appreciate you being here today. One question that people often ask me that I'm going to turn around and throw to you is, why does it matter when things happen as long as we believe that they happen? Take the Exodus, for example. Why all this fuss about when it happened as long as we believe that it actually happened?
For the normal reader and the normal Christian, that probably is enough. If we read the story of David slaying Goliath and then what follows, it makes the story, we appreciate the spiritual value of these things. We appreciate that they happened. And normally that would be enough. However, we live in a world that's hostile to the gospel and hostile to the Bible. And so what is often found is that when someone goes to college, they find that the Bible is not an accurate historical document. To be an accurate historical document, we need to know the chronology of the time. And therefore, it is important for the sake of what is called apologetics, that is the sake of defending the truth of the Bible, to know when things happen, because then we can measure that against Assyrian history or Babylonian history. And it becomes very important to address the objections that are raised and show, in many cases, when we have the correct chronology of the Bible, it sheds light on the ancient Near Eastern chronology around it. And that's been one surprise after another, where the Bible, when you get the chronology correct, it corrects and sheds light on what happened in the ancient Near East. So the Bible is a very valid historical document if you get your chronology right. And it's very useful to refuting some of the people who say the Bible is not a valid historical document. Then we ask the question, if that's not a valid historical document, why does it get everything right in this particular period of time? The chronology is all right, the things that are happening. Why does that happen if you think, which is the thing that's taught, it was an invention much later than these things that happened? How can it be so historically accurate in its chronology and other details?
And Rodger, that reminds me of something that I constantly remind my students of, which is what that communicates to me, among other things, is that chronology, specificity in when things happen precisely, is important to God. We love approaching the Bible and trying to ask the question, what's important in this for me, right? We live in an I, me, myself-centered society, but it seems as though we often forget what's important to God. Doesn't it seem to you like chronology is important to God, that precision in it is important to Him?
Yes, of course, God is the author of mathematics, and the precision is important. And as I mentioned, it's important because the correct chronology, now we can establish the truth of the historicity of things that are happening. One of the things that's not appreciated very much is that the present chronology of the kingdom period, which is where I initially started my publications, was developed by an Adventist scholar named Edwin Tila. And his approach was, despite all the objections to the historicity of the Bible, I'm going to just look at all the data of the kingdom period and see if it comes out, if it hangs together in a coherent way. And he found it did. Now that's quite amazing, because there are so many of those little X became king in year Y of King Z of Israel. So many of those, there's actually about 126 of those exact statements. For it all to hang together in coherent system was quite surprising. But when he did that, then now we're going to assign BC dates. In other words, this is just a puzzle we put together. Now we're going to match it up to Assyrian chronology with giving some dates that are well set. He found that there was a problem. His chronology from the Bible disagreed with the Assyrian chronology by 1 year in the 8th and 9th centuries BC. When he investigated it further, he found out that the commonly accepted Assyrian chronology was wrong by 1 year, and to this day, Assyriologists accept the correction that Edwin Thielen made on Assyrian chronology because of the Bible. Now, you will not find that in Wikipedia. People are trying to suppress the truth of the Bible. You will not find that found. It's an amazing thing, but it is because he found that was so accurate. It's one of those things that's sort of a confounding fact to those Bible skeptics.
One thing that you said really caught my attention, that we are now using the Bible to calibrate or correct errors in secular history. Yes. And I think I was watching the students and their eyes were bright when you were saying that. What did you mean by that?
Well, the example I just gave, Edward Thielen, is one. Another example is the Egyptian chronology, which both of you are very much involved in, because any excavations in Israel, when you find a scarab or something from Egypt, it's very important to correlate that with the Egyptian chronology. Now, probably the chief chronologist, as I read what I do of Egyptologists, they're called, when they try to set a date, the chief authority that they usually refer to is a man named Kenneth Kitchen, who's, I believe, at the University of Liverpool. He's an evangelical scholar, and though I don't agree with everything he writes about Egypt, one of the things that Kenneth Kitchen did when he wrote his very important book, The Third Intermediate Period in Egypt, he tried to straighten out the chronology of things from 690 BC, when there were pretty firm dates because of other historical writings, but it was kind of shifting around before that. He found that when he went to 2 Chronicles 12, verse 2, that there was a synchronism between an Egyptian pharaoh and a king of Judah. That was King Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. And it says in that verse that the 5th year of Rehoboam, that King Shishak came. Now we know from an archaeological finding, the portal of Bubastis, as it's called, that's a portal or the gateway of Bubastis, that this was apparently the very end of the reign of this Shishak, or Shushak is probably a better pronunciation in the Bible. Therefore, Kenneth Kitchen said the end of the reign of Shishak was in 966 BC, which was Thiele's date. And from that point, he went back all the way in the 18th dynasty and constructed. Now, this is the man who is recognized as the chief chronologist of things Egyptian. He's by other Egyptologists. He corrected or refined the dates based on the biblical date because he believed that what Thiele had done was correct. The Egyptian chronology, as well as now the Assyrian, is being corrected from biblical dates. And that, again, is something you will not find broadcast by all these people who say we cannot trust the Bible in historical matters.
Rodger, now that you've taken us down into some of the depths of the details, and that's where, of course, we have a lot of fun, I'd like you to address this question that also is located down there in the depths, which is, what is the basis for firmly building or establishing an Old Testament or chronology or a chronology of the Hebrew Bible?
The forest. The forest of chronological data in the Hebrew Bible. That is the basis. But connected with that forest, there's another principle, proper exegesis. And I see that sometimes people who don't like what the Bible is saying will do a very improper exegesis. Let me give you an example of that. In the crucial date for dating the Exodus is 1 Kings 6, verse 1, which says in the 480th year of the going out of the people of Israel from the land of Egypt, which was the 4th year of King Solomon of Judah, which was the 2nd month, the month of Ziv, foundation of the temple was laid. Now, that statement, the 408th year of the going out, is a very technical phrase. It's found 5 times explicitly in the Pentateuch. It's the year of the going out. When the people of Israel left, that became the start of a new era. We have eras. We have, for instance, the era Anno Domini, or the year of our Lord, where something that happened in the very first is the first year of that. So that was used by Moses in the Pentateuch as a very technical phrase. We're measuring the days in 5 times. It says, this happened in the year so-and-so of the going out. For instance, Aaron died in the year so-and-so of the going out. The tabernacle was started in the year so-and-so. A very technical phrase. And it uses the word motzei, going out, in Hebrew. That same phrase is used in 1 Kings 6:1. It was continuing that era at the time of the era. Now, when it says all those specific things, it was the 4th year of Solomon, it was the 2nd month, the month of Ziv, and it was the 480th year of going out. All those are very technical, chronological terms. And yet those who do not accept that the 480 years means 480 years say, oh no, now we have switched the genre. We have switched, and this is very explicit in some of the people who have criticized my work, is that in the middle of this sentence, we switched to a very sort of hypothetical thing that it's now we're talking about 12 generations of 40 years each. That kind of exegesis is absolutely terrible. I think Doug, who's an expert in exegesis, would say, we have to not only look at the forest, but we need to have proper understanding. And part of that, as I might have indicated, is you must understand the language. You must understand the idioms of the language.
How can someone make that argument, Rodger, for 480 years when the text is telling us it was 479? It's almost like the biblical writer is going out of his way with the month and the day to tell us that it wasn't exactly 480 years. I mean, if they were trying to be metaphorical, wouldn't they have just said 480 years?
You mean beside all the other references in it?
If they were trying to get if the original writer was trying to get the original hearer to think that this was metaphorical, not literal, wouldn't he have just given you 480 rather than...
He would have done some sort of genre change. He would say, it's wonderful that there were 12 generations between, and so on and so forth. But there's nothing of that. It's all technical language.
Yeah, and it goes back to the statement of Cassuto, right? That this number was ordinal, not cardinal, and ordinal numbers are always to be taken literally.
Well, if we get a little more technical, it's in the construct state. The motzei is in the Hebrew. That means it was the going out, the year of, or the year was the year of the going out, rather. And what that means is it was the year of an era. Like when Moses says we set up the tabernacle in the first day of the 2nd year, only 1 year had gone by. It's an ordinal number, as you're mentioning. So when we say after, the word after is not there in the Greek. It was the year 480 of the Exodus. It was the first year of the Exodus was the year of the Exodus. So actually only 479 years gone by. One other thing I might clarify is my initial paper in this field corrected Tila. He had a problem he couldn't solve. All you need to do is move the year 1 year earlier for Solomon, so it was not 966 that Tila used, but it was 967, and that comes out to 1446 exactly.
If people want to get a hold of your papers, Rodger, where can they get them? Are they on academia or?
Yes, they're on academia. Now, if you go to academia, I would recommend you spell my name correctly. There is a D in there, Rodger, RODGERYOUNG, but also I have my own website, rcyoung.org, rcyoung.org.
Let's talk methodology. If I were to say as an archaeologist, methodologically I'm deciding presuppositionally up front, we're not going to take coins into account in our dating system, or we're not going to read pottery because we don't think it's reliable. Those would be presuppositional decisions. What would you say to a scholar or a student who said, I only want to take the book of Exodus to determine the date of the Exodus, none of the other biblical material, but just the book of Exodus in isolation?
Well, I'd question, is this person committed in any way to the Bible? Is this person supposedly a Christian or even a Jewish scholar committed to the Bible? And then what is your basis for taking only Exodus? Now, in the world in which we live, there are certain times we can say, I'm not going to listen to this source because it's like this news source is plainly propaganda. You don't listen to the Iranian television station to find out what's going on in the Middle East. It's all propaganda. But what's the basis for this person rejecting? If the person claims to be a Christian or a conservative Jewish person, why do you just take the book of Exodus? You are saying the rest of the Bible is not inspired? But it also, if you say, I'm going to take evidence of this kind and reject everything else, well, I can show to you that the sun goes around the earth. I mean, now, we're not going to consider any other kind of evidence because it's very obvious that everybody throughout history has regarded it that way. And even these people who say the earth goes around the sun, those hypocrites, they talk about sunrise. But the very important thing is that the Bible starts with Bereshit bara, in the beginning God made the heavens and the earth, and the focus of the whole Bible is on the earth, not on the heavens. So obviously, from a theological standpoint, the sun and all the rest of it goes around the earth. That is the center of the whole Bible. Therefore, that's my case. That's the only evidence I'm going to consider, and don't you dare bring up anything else, because I'm going to go by that evidence. How foolish is a statement to say, I'm only going to consider the Exodus as evidence? You never get anywhere in a court of law like that.
Let me throw it to our professor of exegesis here. If I were, say, wanting to study Johannine theology, maybe I would take the Gospel of John first in isolation to understand the mindset of John, but then I would want to expand it into the Synoptic Gospels and see how it meshes with them to build a chronology. Methodologically, that would be pretty sound. How would you answer this person who's saying I would only use the book of Exodus?
I would say you're committing a fundamental flaw when you have, as we know them, 39 books of the Hebrew Bible, not just one, and many of those books deal with for example, Rodger was talking about the date of the Exodus and so forth. How do you establish that? Well, are there other books of those 39 that also address that historical event? And the truth is, there are. Why? Because this was a foundational moment in ancient Israel's history. It's the moment that everything hinged back on. Their whole history is built on God's supernatural intervention to rip them out of Egypt and provide for them a new foundation. And because that's so important, other writers of the Hebrew Bible address this, and as Rodger pointed out in 1 Kings 6:1, there are specific dates given in reference to, going back to that tent peg, that moment of the Exodus. So how can you divorce those vital passages that other biblical writers use to fall back, to address issues of their day and so forth that go back to that foundational moment? How can you ignore those when they offer information that you can't find in Exodus?
Isn't that a mission of defeat? To say, I have this theory and I can make Exodus, the book of Exodus, conform to my theory, but I cannot admit that other evidence. Isn't that admitting you're a defeated?
Well, I'm trying to understand where people would be coming from, because let's say I want to understand the chronology of the life of Jesus, and I start with the Gospel of John. And I say, I'm only going to use the Gospel of John, that would be, I couldn't do it. The task would be incomplete. So, okay, well, I appreciate your insight on that.
I want to ask you, what are the primary weaknesses in the late Exodus view?
Terrible exegesis. We already discussed 1 Kings 6:1. You've got to be honest in the way you deal with a biblical text. The other things, there are various passages. Now, Kenneth Kitchen, also, that I mentioned, eminent Egyptologist, he also advocates the 13th century Exodus. And it's really pitiful how he treats poor Jephthah in the book of Judges that says there have been 300 years that have gone by since that 300 years does not fit. And he calls him kind of an unlettered fool or something like that. Poor Jephthah, Mr. Kitchen, in heaven, you are going to have to answer to Jephthah, I think. But that's his way of casting that aside. But even less humorous is, for instance, in 1 Chronicles chapter 6. There's a list of a genealogical list, and it's going from the time of the Exodus down to a musician called Haman, I think it was, in the time of David. And actually, then one more generation down the time of Solomon. Now, we've already said that Solomon, his fourth year was 967 BC. It started in 968 fall, actually. since they started their year in the fall. But there are 19 generations listed there. 19 generations back to the 13th century Exodus, which we think is wrong, gives you 15 years per generation. Now think about this. You can say, well, yes, maybe back that time they had very early marriages. Maybe everybody did that. It's still, but the genealogical list is not firstborn. You think about your ancestors, you trace your ancestors back, and most of your ancestors are not firstborn, especially when there were large families. There's no way that can fit, but if you use the correct biblical date of 1446, it's 26 years per generation, and the 19 generations fit. Now, think about what you're doing. Why would people invent extra people in their genealogy? Right. Now, I have some shady characters in my tree. Would like to leave them out, and some of the biblical characters, they just skip over people. They leave them out. You can leave people out of your genealogy, but you don't put people in.
Okay, and that happens, right? Because you back up a few chapters in 1 Chronicles, chapter 2, and you have 5 generations that are mentioned there. And we have one scholar who's arguing that there were only 5 generations from the Exodus to David, because that's all that's given there. And then Ruth 4 has the same truncated or telescoped chronology. Would you agree that methodologically we would take the complete genealogy as opposed to the truncated version? That's
Absolutely, because even in the genealogy of Jesus, there are sometimes, we know there are, because some of the kings are left out, and we know from the book of Kings it's left out. So maybe people do leave rascals out of their genealogy.
Well, I would. This topic's getting us stirred up, as you can tell. Some of these same scholars that Dr. Petrovich brought up and that you're talking about, they're very open that a generation, in their view, is on average 25 years. So, for example, Hoffmeyer and Kitchen. So how could then you turn around and say 15.2 years or something like that when they're on the record as saying that an average generation would be 25?
Well, it's not being consistent, is it? No, it's not. Some people say consistency is the hobgoblin of petty minds. Well, so I must be a petty mind because I try to be consistent. And of course, I believe the Bible is consistent.
Let's circle back to Jephthah for just a minute, because I think everyone agrees that we would place him around 1100, give or take a few years. So then the only way to deal with his testimony, he's saying, my people have now been in this land for 300 years. So 1100 plus 300 would be 1400, which would synchronize very nicely.
May I ask you a question? How do you think poor Jephthah, this fool, how do you think he knew there were 300 years?
Well, he was part of the religious culture. The priests kept track of the cycles.
Which cycles?
The Jubilee Cycles, for example. Is that something you want to talk about? Because I've heard you talk about, I think it's Ezekiel 41 and the Jubilee Cycles. How does that fit in?
Very well. And also, what about this fact that I said they were measuring an era all the way, the era of the going out. The era of the going out all the way from the year the Exodus occurred. So they did have a calendar. Did you want me to say something about the Jubilee Cycles?
Well, yes. Let me circle around on Jephthah. We're going to save his reputation here. I argued recently that Eusebius trashed the reputation of Papias after the Council of Nicaea, and so we've got to go back and kind of rescue Papias's reputation. Maybe we've got to do that for Jephthah too. We'll be like a PR firm, and we'll rehab his reputation. He says that it was about 300 years, and we all agree that it was around the year 1100. The only way to get around that is that what Kitchen does is to say, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a country bumpkin. He's uneducated. We should not take that seriously. That's cavalier, isn't it?
Well, it's necessary to, if you want to discard evidence that disagrees with what your opinion is, yes. It's really because he has it's something he has to discredit.
Okay, I think our listeners are going to enjoy this discussion about Ezekiel 40 verse 1. So in, maybe just a few minutes, see if you can give us the Jubilee cycles and why they're important.
All right. There are actually 2 ways of measuring time, and Dr. Stripling has already mentioned the second method. When they entered the land of Israel, they were to start counting years by the 7 years was to be a sabbatical year when they let the land lay fallow. And every seventh sabbatical year was to be a Jubilee year. So the Jubilee year, now there's a lot of discussion about this, but the Jubilee year was actually identical to the 7th sabbatical year. So there's a period of 49 years going on. And as in every ancient Near Eastern society, the people who kept track of the years were always the priests, because all the ritual and all that dealt with the years. The calendar was kept by priests. That is true universally, isn't it, Dr. Petrovich, throughout the ancient Near East. Even if the people were not observing the sabbatical year, even if the people were not observing the weekly Sabbath, they had to know when it was. Now, so our now hero Jephthah had two ways of keeping track of that. He could have asked a priest where we are in the sabbatical cycles and the Jubilee cycles, or he could have gone by, this is the year of the Exodus, so and so. Now, an interesting passage that actually pointed out that I learned from my contributions and participation in David Roll's forum, and I've been a good member in standing, I hope a good member in standing, that ever since almost from 2003 and so on, I've interacted and learned a lot from the forum of David Roll, and the people, very educated scholars, a lot of them are participating there. But one person one time pointed out the fact that the Jewish literature says that there was well, basically what it means is there was a Jubilee observed in the year 574 BC. And the Jewish literature says it was the 17th Jubilee. Now the literature is
17th, 1-7.
The 17th.
Okay.
Which you measure 16 times 49 back, and you come up with the start of the counting. Now it says specifically in Leviticus 25 they start when they entered the land. Later Jewish tradition, which doesn't match that, tries to change that, but it's and I could go into that, but I won't. So you measure back the 16 to 49 year cycles, you can come up with 1406. So Jephthah had two ways that were both operative. What's interesting is that is exactly in agreement with 1 Kings 6:1. And I have tried, of course, this is very alarming to the people who support the 13th century Exodus. How do they explain that? My background's in mathematics. I deal with probability, or dealt with probability. How do you explain that it just happens to work out exactly correctly? Any if you don't throw away the side it was the 17th, it works out exactly correctly. Now another thing is to study the Hebrew text of that verse. 40 relates to Ezekiel 40 verse 1. It says it was Rosh Hashanah. It was the 10th of the month. Rosh Hashanah is New Year's Day, mistranslated almost everywhere as it was just the beginning of the year. Well, Rosh Hashanah, it was the 10th of the month. Only on a Jubilee was Rosh Hashanah on the 10th of the month, and that's in Leviticus 25 also. So that the Hebrew text itself.
And doesn't the Seder Olam also synchronize with that?
Exactly. I would like to say something about this 2nd century BC document, the Seder Olam, because Seder Olam means the order of the ages, or the history of the world. Seder, remember the Passover, Seder, the order of the Passover. Olam means both age or eternity. This document was written by a disciple of the famous Rabbi Akiva, who was a witness of the destruction of the Second Temple. So that in itself is interesting because it relates on the chronology of the Second Temple. But he tried to generate a chronology all the way from Adam to his own time. And what he says is that Ezekiel, when Ezekiel chapter 40 verse 1, when Ezekiel saw the great vision of the last 9 chapters of the book, it was the beginning of a Jubilee year. And it was the 17th Jubilee. Now, the 17th Jubilee doesn't fit with his chronology, which the previous, so it must have been remembered, and what's what I said, that the priests, no matter who they were, what the people were doing, not observing the sabbatical years, it was still their duty to keep track of them. And so this apparently is a historical remembrance, and the fact that it matches exactly is to me so extremely improbable that it would match the chronological data we get just from 1 Kings 6:1 and following Thiele's chronology, and as I say, my 1-year correction to Thiele. How do you explain that? Well, the best way to do it is just not to address it, to say, well, it's just an accident. But there are two powerful testimonies that are exact to the year of the test. Of course, we assume a 40-year wilderness time, but those two exact testimonies, 1 Kings 6:1 plus the Jubilee, that's implicit in the Hebrew text of Ezekiel 41, come out to exactly the same. And I don't feel that my critics, now I've been propounding this for some time, and eminent scholars have tried, who hold the 13th century Exodus, have tried to refute me on that. I feel none of their refutations are credible. To me, as someone who has a mathematical training, I feel you have not explained it, and you have not addressed the real issue.
Fortunately, this is being recorded. It's audio and video. So that's going to be new for a lot of people. They've never heard of the Jubilee Cycles and Seder Olam. Maybe that's new terminology. But they can just go back and hit rewind and listen to that several times. I think it's very powerful.
Yeah, and if they want to go into more depth, they can consult his journal articles that have been published, because he goes into great depth in dealing with the Jubilee Cycles and its impact on the dating of Old Testament chronology.
Yeah. You have to appreciate something like Ezekiel. They were just counting the years, even though the rest of the people didn't care one whit about whether it was a sabbatical year. The priests were faithful to what God said, and that's something of a lesson to us, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. It's good. It is.
We're going to change gears here, and you got a big book next to you, a big blue book, and this is a friend of ours. We call him Joe, but maybe the audience calls him Josephus, and we refer to him all the time. He has some things to say that are pertinent to chronology, and in particular to the Exodus. And so he has some things to say about the Exodus. He's a first century Jewish historian, but he's citing some earlier Egyptian historians. Can you take a few minutes and tell us about these guys, Manetho, Chaeremon, and so forth?
Yes. In his book, Against Apion, Josephus is trying to maintain the antiquity of the Jewish race and against the critics who say that you're just a Johnny-come-lately on the scene, and he's trying to establish how ancient the Israelite history is. And so he quotes different authors. He quotes Babylonian authors. He quotes Greek authors back from, not many Greek, because the Greeks really were Johnny-come-lately on this scene, but he quotes Egyptian authors. And he quotes three of them. One of them is Manetho, another is Chaeremon, and the other one is what was his name?
Lysimachus.
Lysimachus. Mm-hmm. And what we are getting here is an Egyptian view of things of the Israelites.
Like 3rd century BC, thereabouts.
Yeah, that was about the time. What was Manetho was from about 320 to about 280, we think, it was BC. And he was apparently associated with the library. At the time of scholarly learning, they wanted to know about these things, and he wrote these things in Greek. An Egyptian, maybe a priest, who wrote these things. I believe he was a priest of Serapis, wrote these things in Greek. And so to prove the antiquity of his nation, he quotes, Josephus quotes Manetho, and particularly what's interesting to us is what Manetho says about the Exodus. Now, Manetho does mention the Exodus, but you have to filter this through something else. Josephus does not understand Manetho. Manetho talks about somebody called the Hyksos, very important to anybody in Egyptology, the Hyksos. And he talks about how the Hyksos were in a place called Avaris, and they were driven out of the land, all very consistent with what modern Egyptologists believe. The Hyksos were driven out of the land at the beginning of the 18th dynasty by these pharaohs, and they went into the land. They left the land of Canaan, left their city of Avaris behind them. Manetho goes on to say that after that, he puts some hundreds of years, his figure is probably too large, there was another group of Semites in there, and this group, now propaganda, this was a scabby, leprous bunch. And you see how the propaganda starts to enter, and they were, very. And I would like to read something he says
That's
about.
talking about our ancestors, right? This scabby bunch, yeah.
Not our ancestors, the Jewish
well,
ancestors.
our spiritual ancestors.
Yes, and says Manetho says that the slaves who refused to worship the Egyptian gods and then sacrifice to their god animals that they regarded as sacred. See, they regarded the cow as sacred. Here are these Hebrews wanting to sacrifice a cow of all things. And he went out to get them. Now, this is a quote from Manetho. With 300,000 of the most warlike of the Egyptians went to meet the enemy. And this is section 246, sentence 246, book 1, Against Apion. With 300,000 of the most warlike, this is a big number. Now, it may be exaggerated, but it's big. But then thinking that to join battle with them would be a fight against the gods, he returned and came to Memphis. No explanation of what happened. What happened to your army, Mr. Who? The interesting thing is that he names the pharaoh Amenophis. Amenophis is Greek for Amenhotep. Doug did not even know that when he named the pharaoh of the Exodus Amenhotep. Right. And the only pharaohs named Amenophis or Amenhotep were the 18th dynasty. A marvelous verification from a propaganda viewpoint Josephus didn't understand it. He kept mixing up the Hyksos with these scabby leprous people who left. And he also quotes another fellow named Karaman, another Egyptian historian, who said that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Amenophis. And that's a marvelous verification of what? A 15th century Exodus.
Right. So, Doug, when you did your research and determined that Amenhotep II, and I share your view, was the most likely candidate for the Pharaoh of the Exodus, you were unaware of this synchronism in Josephus.
I don't remember if I had read it or not. I definitely didn't include it in the article. But I may not even have been aware of it at the time.
Because that's fascinating.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Well, I'm older than Doug. In this matter, I do remember something better. When I told that to Doug, he did not know it.
Okay. All right. We'll trust your recollection on that.
The time has flown. This has been a fascinating discussion about chronology. You've been able to hang out with us here, Rodger, at the Bible Seminary the last couple of days. It's been our honor. What would you say to someone who's thinking about coming to the Bible Seminary?
This is such a pleasant atmosphere here. These are people that believe the Bible and love the Lord, and they're interested in what the Bible says, and they are just excellent scholars. And I might say also that the place that they're excavating in Israel are possibly where there could be real breakthroughs in the very near future. What they're doing there is very important. Shiloh, and some work to do with Mount Ebal, and also Dr. Stripling is wrapping up the work on Kibbutz Makatir. These are important things in the kingdom of God, I believe, and this is a beautiful place to be, and I've just really enjoyed my 3 days here.
It's been a joy to have you, Rodger. God bless you.
Thank you.